The apartment we lived in was nothing to boast about, but it was our sanctuary. The walls were thin, and the floors creaked like they were tired too, but we made do. The faded floral wallpaper in the kitchen had a strange comfort to it, though it was peeling in places, like a sign of the life that had been lived there. I could see the wear on the furniture, the couch with its sunken cushions, the table with chipped edges, but they were more than just objects. They were markers of the little victories we'd fought for. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Mornings started early. I'd wake to the smell of instant coffee brewing, the sharp, earthy scent filling the apartment. I often saw her, standing at the kitchen counter, her hands working mechanically, setting the table for herself before slipping on her worn coat. She had no time to eat with me, she had to catch the bus to work. It was a diner job that didn't pay much, but it was all she had. Her routine was predictable, every day, the same hurried motions, yet there was a fierce determination in her eyes. I couldn't understand why she always moved so quickly, like time was chasing her, but I felt the urgency in the air. I remember one winter morning, the cold creeping through the thin walls, seeping into our bones. The heater was broken again, and I could see my breath as I lay in bed, shivering under the thick quilt my mother had made herself. She'd walked into my room that morning with a faint smile, but her eyes were different. There was something in them that made my heart race, a quiet desperation.
"Stay warm, honey,"
she said, though I could see her lips tremble slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper. She left in her coat, her scarf wrapped tightly, and I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was going on in her head. It wasn't until later that day that I learned she'd been walking to the bus stop, a bitter wind cutting through her thin jacket, when she'd fainted in the middle of the street. A passerby had seen her and helped her to the diner where she worked, and somehow, she managed to finish her shift. She never told me. I found out later, when I overheard a conversation between her and one of her co-workers, who had said,
"She doesn't stop, does she? No matter what happens."
My mother didn't let anyone see her break. Another time, I remember the day the car broke down. It was an old, clunky sedan she had bought from a used car lot with money she didn't have. The transmission was always shaky, and the engine would cough and sputter like it was trying to give up. But it was all we had, and it got her to work. One afternoon, on her way back from the diner, it stalled on the side of the road. I could see her standing by the car through the window, trying to figure out what to do. I watched as she tried to wave down cars for help, but no one stopped. I could see the frustration and embarrassment written on her face, but she didn't give in. Instead, she opened the hood, despite not knowing much about engines, and tinkered with it, trying to start it again. After what seemed like hours, she managed to get it going, only for it to die once more a mile down the road. I had to meet her halfway, walking through the rain, soaked to the bone, before we both pushed the car home together. Later that night, while I dried off in front of the small space heater, she quietly went into the bathroom to wash up. She didn't speak about it, but when I saw her reflection in the mirror, her hair clinging to her face, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped the fog from the glass, I realized just how much she was carrying. It wasn't just the car. It wasn't just the bills piling up. It was the crushing weight of a life she could barely keep together. Yet, somehow, she kept moving forward. One of the most dramatic and poignant moments came during a summer evening. We sat together on the worn couch, watching the sun set through the tiny window that barely let in any light. The city noise, horns, people shouting, sirens, drifted in, but we were silent, as we often were in those moments. She had just come back from another long shift, her feet sore, her back aching. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in what felt like forever.
"Honey, I'm doing this all for you, you know that, right? So you won't have to worry the way I do. You'll be able to have the things I never had."
It was the only time she ever admitted that the struggle was getting to her. She never showed weakness. She never allowed me to see her break. But in that one moment, when I saw the vulnerability in her face, I realized just how deep her sacrifices went. That summer, I started to understand the weight of her love, her commitment, and her unspoken fears. Her quiet resilience was no longer just something I admired, it was something I feared I would lose one day. The intensity of her efforts to shield me from hardship began to feel like a heavy burden, one I could never fully grasp. But the truth was, I wasn't prepared for what was coming next. And neither was she. As I entered my teenage years, the weight of our life became more apparent. I could see the exhaustion in my mother's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped slightly under the constant pressure. The day-to-day struggle to keep us afloat was no longer something that could be hidden behind quiet smiles or forced optimism. I noticed it in the way she would lose herself in thought when she thought I wasn't looking, her gaze distant, like she was mentally escaping to some place far away from the stress of our reality. There was the time when her car, the one we had barely managed to keep running, was towed away. She had been behind on payments for months, but it wasn't something we could talk about. We couldn't afford the fees, and the mere thought of losing that car, the last thing that helped her get to work and back, sent a ripple of panic through her. One afternoon, I walked outside to find her standing in front of the tow truck, her face pale, hands shaking as she tried to reason with the driver. Her usual strength faltered, her voice barely above a whisper, pleading with him to let her keep it for just a little while longer.
"I'll find the money. I swear,"
she said, but the driver wasn't moved. When the truck pulled away, I saw the way her hands clenched into fists, the look of helplessness on her face that she never let me see. That night, she walked around the apartment in silence, staring out the window, and I could feel the tension in the air. It was the first time I truly understood how fragile our situation was, and how much she was trying to protect me from that reality. Days after that, she was forced to take the bus to work, which meant she had to wake up even earlier. The grueling routine of working long shifts on her feet, with no time for breaks, was wearing her down in ways I had never imagined. It wasn't just the physical toll, it was the mental strain that began to show in small ways. One evening, after returning from a shift, she collapsed onto the couch without even bothering to take off her shoes. She didn't say anything for a long while, just stared at the ceiling, as if waiting for the strength to get back up. It was the first time I had seen her so utterly defeated. I remember sitting beside her, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, unsure if she was even aware that I was there. It felt like she was just holding on, waiting for something to give. The next day, she went back to work without a word, as if nothing had happened. But I knew then, something inside her was breaking, little by little. Another unforgettable scene came when I was 15. We had barely scraped together enough to pay rent that month, and I could see the deep lines etched into my mother's face. We didn't have enough for groceries, and as I was getting ready to leave for school one morning, I saw her standing in front of the open fridge, staring at the empty shelves. The only things left were a few wilted carrots and some expired milk. She closed the door quietly, a faint sigh escaping her lips, and I could see the tears she quickly wiped away before turning to get ready for another grueling day. I didn't say anything, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to fix it. That afternoon, I came home early from school to find her sitting at the table with a note in front of her. It was from the landlord, a notice about overdue rent. I watched as she ran her fingers along the edge of the letter, her face pale. This wasn't just about the rent, it was the threat of losing the only place we had ever known. Later that night, she came into my room, sitting on the edge of my bed, her voice quieter than usual.
"Honey, I'll figure it out. I always do."
But I could see the strain in her face, the silent frustration of having to constantly hold everything together. It was a fragile promise, one I wasn't sure she could keep. That evening, I overheard a conversation between her and a coworker at the diner. I was eavesdropping, though I tried not to make it obvious. They were talking about how my mother had been covering extra shifts, even though she was clearly worn thin. The coworker asked her why she pushed herself so hard, and my mother's response was simple.
"Because I don't have another choice."
There was no romanticized notion of sacrifice in her voice, just a matter-of-fact reality that she had to do it, no matter the cost. That night, after everyone had left the diner, she sat at the counter by herself, her hands folded in front of her. The fluorescent lights above buzzed in the silence. I had come to pick her up, and as I stood there, watching her, I saw a side of her I had never seen before, vulnerable, tired, and alone. It was the first time I realized that my mother wasn't invincible. She was human. And I had never felt so helpless. Then, there was the time when I started to see the physical effects of her exhaustion. One night, she came home late, and I could hear her stumbling into the apartment. She was unsteady on her feet, like she might collapse at any moment. I rushed to help her, but she waved me off with a weak smile.
I'm fine, honey. Just tired,
she said, but I could see the tremble in her hands as she tried to hang up her coat. I helped her to the couch, but she didn't complain, she never did. She just closed her eyes for a moment, her face contorted in pain, her breath shallow. She had been working long hours for weeks without rest, and her body was starting to betray her. The next morning, I woke up to find her gone again, already on her way to work. But I noticed something, she was limping, the way her foot dragged slightly behind her. She never said a word about it. It was the silent price of survival. That was when the harsh truth became undeniable, my mother was falling apart. But she kept pushing forward, too proud to let me see just how broken she was. Yet, I couldn't shake the image of her, weak, yet still determined. It was a paradox I would carry with me for years to come. The years passed, I began to notice the cracks in my mother's once unshakable armor. She had always been the pillar of strength in my life, an invincible force who kept our world intact despite the odds. But as I grew older, I started to see the signs that something was wrong. Her resilience, the very thing that had defined her, began to transform into something darker, something unspoken. It wasn't just the tired eyes or the occasional sighs, it was something much deeper, a quiet storm that I couldn't yet understand. One of the most vivid moments of that shift happened one evening, a time that would haunt me for years. It was late in the evening, and the only sound in our apartment was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I had just come back from school, and the house was silent, which wasn't unusual, except that the lights were dim. When I walked into the living room, I saw my mother sitting by the window, staring out at the street below. Her face was pale, and her eyes were distant, unfocused, as if she were somewhere else entirely. She didn't move when I entered the room, and I stood there, unsure of what to say. I sat down next to her, feeling the weight of the silence between us. There was no angry outburst, no big event to mark this moment, just the quiet, oppressive stillness that seemed to hang in the air. My mother was a woman of few words, but this silence, this absence of her usual energy, felt different. It was as though she had retreated somewhere I couldn't follow. After a long pause, she finally spoke, but her voice was soft, almost hollow.
Sometimes, I wonder how long I can keep this up.
Those words, spoken in a tone I had never heard before, sent a cold shiver down my spine. My mother was the one who always said, "We can make it through anything. Just keep going." But here, in this moment, she sounded fragile. It was as if all the weight she had carried for so long, unspoken fears, unshed tears, and the constant pressure to survive, was suddenly too much for her to bear. I remember wanting to ask her what was wrong, to push her to open up, but I didn't. She was always the one who kept us going, who kept me going. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing her broken. So, I just sat beside her, in that heavy silence, not knowing how to reach her. A few days later, I began to see more signs that things weren't right. She started missing work, not often, but enough to be noticeable. At first, she tried to hide it. She would say she was just tired or feeling under the weather, but I knew it wasn't just physical fatigue anymore. It was something more elusive, something that she refused to acknowledge. One afternoon, I came home to find her sitting on the couch, her head resting in her hands. The door was ajar, and she hadn't even bothered to change out of her uniform. Her coat was still on, her shoes still laced up. The way she sat there, her body curled inward, was a stark contrast to the woman I had always known, strong, confident, unshakable. I asked her if she was okay, and her response was flat, almost robotic.
I'm fine, just tired, that's all.
But something in her eyes told me she wasn't. There was a hollowness to her gaze, a numbness I couldn't ignore. I watched her for a long time, wondering if I should push her to talk, to say something, but I didn't. I was afraid of what I might hear, afraid that the facade she had built for so long would crumble completely. The next incident came like a quiet storm. One afternoon, I came back from school and found the apartment eerily quiet. Usually, I could hear her moving about, rustling through the kitchen, or humming as she worked. But that day, there was nothing. I called out to her, but when I didn't hear a response, I went searching for her. I found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. Her shoulders were hunched in a way I had never seen before, so small, so fragile, as if she were trying to shrink into herself. She was silent when I approached, her back turned to me. I stood there for a moment, unsure of how to help, when she suddenly spoke, her voice barely audible.
I'm so tired. I can't keep doing this anymore.
Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had never heard her express vulnerability in such a raw way, and I didn't know how to respond. For the first time, I saw my mother not as an unbreakable force, but as a woman who was drowning in the weight of the life she had built for us. She wasn't asking for pity or sympathy, but I could see the desperation in her eyes, the need for something, anything, to change. I tried to comfort her, to assure her that everything would be okay, but I wasn't sure I believed it myself. She had been carrying so much for so long, and I didn't know how to help her share the load. Another moment that stands out in my mind happened one rainy evening. The storm had come out of nowhere, and the wind howled against the windows. The rain lashed at the apartment, and the lights flickered occasionally as the power threatened to go out. We sat in the dim light of the living room, listening to the storm, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. It was then that I heard her sobbing quietly from the kitchen.